after 25 years, I'm with Gerison Lansdown again, who came to Jersey 25 years ago for a little series of talks I gave for Liberation celebrations, Liberation 50. Now it's 25 years on. We were going to have a conference this year, and you were going to speak at the conference this year, a full-blown conference on human rights. Of course, the virus has blown that away. So you were going to do a catch-up for me about what we're going to tell you what's been going on in Jersey for 25 years. But now you can tell us what's been going on in the rest of the world for 25 years. I'll just say, 25 years ago, you brought me this book, which is a big book, and I don't know if anybody ever bought a copy. And you gave me 2 books. I gave one away to somebody. I forget who I gave it to now.
It got used widely, actually. I mean, we used it with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, plus a summary. We didn't expect them to read all that, but it got pretty widely included into university libraries as a resource and so on. And so it was quite a innovative thing at the time. I think it was the first time there'd ever been a global.
How long did it take to write the book?
It took us about 1.5 years to put it all together and to do the research. And of course, it was pre-internet, so we had to do it all manually and collate it. We had to we consulted with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bodies and individuals and groups all over the country. We consulted with, 80 groups of children. We had to go and get, you couldn't just download the regulations online. You had to go and get them from government libraries and so on and so forth. So it was a very different process of working than now. And what we wanted to do, I mean, no one had ever mapped children's rights in the UK before. It was a very, very new phenomenon. And so what we were trying to do was conceptualize what the Convention on the Rights of the Child meant, and then try and look at that in relation to law, policy and practice as it stood across the 4 nations of the UK. So it was a pretty demanding task, which was, as I say, no one had ever done before. But we involved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and so it was a really amazing collaborative effort to put it together.
Just in case all this fails, I'm going to turn my camera on here, so I've got a second copy of this. At least I'll have the sound. So,
okay,
just as a belt and braces job. Because I don't know what it is about technology and me, but technology loves to go wrong. So then, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, had it been signed when you produced that book?
Yeah, no, it was ratified in the UK in 91, and then we started the development unit at the beginning of 92, and we produced that, I think, in 1995, so it was a real attempt to put down on paper where, a sort of baseline where we are in the UK across and what these rights mean, because no one had ever sort of interpreted. Many of these rights were very, very new conceptually, because they do differ in orientation and substance in many ways from rights in the international covenants, for example, or the European Convention. So we had to kind of unpack all of that and look at what does this mean, and what does this mean in relation to how we operationalize this now? How do we understand this in our practice now? So it was a really, it was trying to help people understand what these rights mean for children and what the obligations were that we'd signed up to, and to try and make it real.
Who initially, because if you were there for 5 years and then monitoring it, who initially was using it, the book? Who had it by their desk?
Oh, all of the NGOs working with children, bodies like the Royal College of Pediatrics, Royal College of Nursing, academic libraries, lots and lots of academics, both in the human rights field, but in the field of child welfare and child psychology and education and so on. So it was. We sent it to lots of parliamentarians. So it had some, it became quite widely known. UNICEF quoted it in their State of the World's Children one year. It was.
This is where because I'm not in the system here. I don't know. I don't know what goes on really at as they say, the coal phase. I use that rarely with children. I haven't got children at school. I don't know where it's. But I get the feeling, not very much has changed. Now the Children's Commissioner will reveal all. She's been invited to the United Nations. She's taking a gang of children with her, and she's managed, because there are no NGOs really to speak of, but NSPCC, I think, are going with her. They've got a little group together to go to Geneva. But generally speaking, as far as the general public is concerned, I don't think there's much that, because Jersey's signed it, there's not much interest in it really. I'm not aware of anybody who's made any attempt to read the convention. Right. Is that what happens in the UK? Is that what happened?
Well, I think it's quite difficult to I mean, it's difficult to quantify it, but if you look at, I mean, the first thing to say, I suppose, is that it's not a magic wand. It's not a cure-all. It's not going to solve all the problems of the world's children. But what it does do, I suppose, is it provides a set of standards, a set of principles, and a framework against which to advocate and against which to hold governments to account. So I think what it did really importantly was to shifted the language from children having needs to children having rights, and with that comes an entitlement and a set of obligations on the part of governments and an accountability. So it enables you to have a set of standards against which you can hold the government to account. So I think that's really important. But the other thing it did, and I do think both of these things have had an impact in various ways. The second thing it does is that it shifts the language away from children simply being objects of protection to becoming subjects of rights. So children have a voice, children are entitled to be heard, children are seen as agents to some extent of their own, exercising their own rights and so on. So instead of being these kind of passive, controlled, managed, vulnerable individuals, they become people in their own right and entitled to be heard and entitled to be respected and entitled to dignity. So I think those are kind of quite conceptual things. They're not concrete, but I think they've shifted the language around which we've begun to talk about children in legislation and policy. So I think those things are important. But in terms of in terms of what that's done, I mean, just let me give you an example. So because nearly every country in the world has ratified, these are now recognized as global norms. So some years ago in the US, which obviously hasn't ratified, the Supreme Court was addressing the issue of the death penalty for children under 18. And in their judgment, they argued that the right, a prohibition on killing children, judicial killing of children, which is embedded in the CRC, has become a global norm. And although the US hadn't ratified it, they had to take account of that global context within which children were being treated and assessed. And they ruled against the death penalty for juveniles on the basis of that. So even though they hadn't ratified, the fact that these have become global norms influenced the Supreme Court in the States. And I think, those things are significant.
But there are separate, you see, this is what I can't quite grasp, why it's necessary to have a separate children, because there are separate conventions, treaties about death penalty.
Yeah.
So before, without the Convention on Rights of the Child, the death penalty was stopped in the UK, obviously the Parliament locally, but it became an international norm not to have the death penalty. Some people still do execute, but generally it's an international norm, adults or children. So it makes them. So why is it necessary to have a special one for children? That's what
they still do have the death penalty for adults. What the CRC has done is make a specific requirement that the death penalty should not be imposed on anyone under 18, and that influenced the court. There are many things in the convention which are different from the adult treaties. They're not the same. So, and what we know is that although the international covenants, on civil and political rights, socio-economic, cultural rights, all applied in principle to children. In reality, they have not been addressed to deal with the particularities of children's situation. And the differences for children are that children lack autonomy. There is a presumption in law in most countries that once you reach adulthood, if you like, 18 or whenever it is, you have autonomy. You have an autonomous right to make decisions for yourself. That right does not extend to children. So they have a different status in law from adults. And what the CRC does is seek to address how you deal with that in a way which recognises children's dignity and children's right to be heard without affording them autonomy in adulthood. So the fact that we have Article 12, the right of children to be heard, the fact that we recognise children's best interests, which is not embedded in any other international treaty, the fact that it includes specific provisions in relation to family life and protection in relation to family life. It has a whole set of provisions which are additional to those contained in other human rights treaties, which address the particularities of childhood status. So I think it's it doesn't run counter to, but it strengthens and adds to the pre-existing.
Execution is an extreme instance of what could happen. But for the more usual application of articles, where does it make? Because I'm still struggling with this, because people right to a fair hearing, well, that applies to anybody under conventions anyway. So
yes,
children should have right fair hearing anyway.
Of course, and those are included in the European Convention and in the International Covenant. What the CRC talks about is the particularities of the vulnerability of children. So the separation of children from adults when they are held in penal institutions, the right to recognition of children's best interests, the right of contact with family, the right of children to be heard. Those things are added standards which recognise the children's youth and children's particular vulnerability. So the strong emphasis on diversion, on alternatives to prison, and so on and so forth are all much stronger in the CRC than they are in other treaties, because children are more vulnerable and they're more likely to be harmed by those sorts of.
As you all know, the Convention for the Discrimination Against Women has still not been ratified for Jersey. That's still not been ratified. They were hoping to ratify it in New York before the lockdown, but they haven't got around to it. So they've had another excuse not to do so. Now, you can't have women being excluded from rights because that convention hasn't been ratified, can you? I mean, the European Convention of Human Rights applies to them just as much as anybody else. Adult women, I mean, you can't exclude them. You can't just say they should have lesser rights. I don't get it. Where the Convention on the Rights of the Child, who presses the activate button? Because it still hasn't. The activate button hasn't been pressed for Jersey. It's still.
I'm not sure what you mean by who presses. But if you look at if around the world, so for example, on violence, the right to protection from all forms of violence. Prior to the CRC, nobody was talking about violence against children. There was no research really being done into this area internationally. So now we've seen almost every country in the world introduce stronger protective legislation, recognizing 55 countries have legislated to abolish corporal punishment in all settings, including the home. That was one before the CRC. That was Sweden before the CRC. We've seen laws protecting children in the justice system, laws protecting children from violence in the family, violence in schools, laws protecting children from sexual abuse, right across the world, which simply didn't exist before. And they have been brought in specifically in response to the CRC, because largely UNICEF, worked with governments to look at how can we translate these principles that you've now ratified into practical reality in legislation on the ground. And those things have happened. They are profound changes. Now, there's a gap between legislation and implementation and resourcing and training and capacity, but nevertheless, the legal framework is in place in most countries. Most countries have raised the age of criminal responsibility in response to the CRC. The awareness of female genital mutilation has been raised massively. There's huge campaigns around that, specifically in response to growing awareness of sexual violence and harmful practices against girls and indeed against boys, and as a result those practices have reduced.
Could that not, I mean, for example, in the United Kingdom example, could that not have been dealt with under existing laws as being an assault on a person or whatever it would have been? Would that not have been covered without having to deal with it separately?
Of course it could, but it didn't. That's the point.
That's the problem.
In most parts of the world, you can always achieve a given end through a number of different routes. The fact is that because the Convention on the Rights of the Child had such a high profile, was ratified almost universally, because UNICEF, which is the main agency working across the world with children, with governments, had this as its top priority. It was working with governments. It gave it an agenda. It gave it empathy. Resources were put into it. Expertise was put in. Time and energy investment was put into supporting governments to make these changes, which would not have happened and had not happened until you got the CRC. So it's not that you couldn't have done that without the CRC. The fact is, it didn't happen. But once you got the CRC,
people, lawyers, saying to me, well, you can quote that. You can quote the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Covenants on Economic, Social and Culture, but they haven't been ratified. In the activate button hasn't been pressed for Jersey. In other words, in theory, the UK government has signed for them, but they're not extended. So the right of petition, if it exists, isn't been ratified for. So it's the same with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The report that's going on now is by virtue of the Geneva visit, is a general thing by virtue of the UK's application. It's a report that's been made by the United Nations about the whole United Kingdom and the Channel Islands. I don't know whether about Guernsey. I don't know. I've tried to find out about Guernsey. They haven't ratified the convention, so it seems like they're not going. So, I don't know about the Isle of Man. It was ironic too, because the first challenge about corporal punishment for the United Kingdom, British Isles, was because it was from the Isle of Man. And that was the extraordinary thing.
Yeah.
See? So these things have got a very strange way of coming and being enacted, being enforced. So therefore, there was a decision there against the Isle of Man, but basically it was a decision against the United Kingdom as a high contracting party. It was a sort of a weird. That's the way it happens, and so there will be cases go against under the European Convention. But when can cases start going somewhere under the Convention on the Rights of the Child? This is what I want to know. This is what I think people need to activate it.
Well, there isn't. There's no court. It's solved. Unlike the European Convention on Human Rights, obviously there isn't a court. There's no sanction. There's just the constructive dialogue, as it's described, with the Committee on the Rights of the Child and sort of international pressure and so on. So, for example, in East Africa, after the Committee on the Rights of the Child produced a general comment on early years. That was picked up, and quite a lot of the East African countries, Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda and so on, were responding to that, and UNICEF was working with them to look at how can we strengthen the capacity and the provision of early years education and care. And there was a regional conference, and Uganda and Kenya were doing quite a lot, and Tanzania doing far less, and it shamed Tanzania into feeling they had to put far more resource into this and make more effort and convene some sort of energy into strengthening their early years provision, and wanted to work with academics and with NGOs and so on, as well as UNICEF, to try and push that forward. Now, attribution's always problematic. How do you can't attribute one complex process to any specific individual causal factor. But the fact is that the CRC was the framework, was the underpinning, it was the kind of language, and it was the driver that informed a huge amount of those debates and the work of the committee and so on. So altogether, those things began to produce some progress in awareness.
It's good news. You've travelled the world. You've seen it in different places. Is it being effective? Is it being effective?
Well, in many ways it is. So, for example, last year I've been 2 or 3 times now to the Emirates, where money is absolutely not a problem. They have unlimited resources financially, but they wanted to become. They wanted to achieve child-friendly city status. In other words, a rights-respecting Sharjah, one of the Emirates, wanted to become a rights-respecting environment and for children. And so we went over there to work with them on doing this, and they were really, really keen to do changes. So, for example, we were looking a lot at how they created, what was happening in schools, and they proudly told me, that they had school councils in every school and so on. But when we went, the reality was there was absolutely they had these school councils. They did like in many countries in the world, they do absolutely nothing. They raise funds for charity, or they organise the end of school dance or whatever. They don't do anything in terms of the curriculum or the content or the teaching methodologies or the, discrimination or whatever. And so I did a sort of, you met with a whole load of children in lots of different schools, and we discussed what was going on, and I presented the findings to the education ministry, and then they reflected on, then they invited me back 6 months later to run a workshop for teachers and head teachers, and a workshop for children, and to help them develop a strategy on how to move forward. So, those, it will be slow, it will take time, but they are genuinely listening to the importance of making some of those changes.
Aspect, now you can go there, why can't they know that for themselves? I mean, they're not stupid in the Middle East. I mean, they're very intelligent people.
They're not.
Why don't they just?
No, they're not stupid at all. But they don't have they don't have a culture of participatory engagement. They don't come from a democratic history, so they don't have any of that. They don't have that institutionally embedded in the kind of in their education system, in their social relationships, in their political environment, and so on. So they want to engage with people who have explored some of those things, to bring them in. They've got hugely talented people, hugely able people, as they have in every country in the world. But dialogue and exchange between countries can help stimulate discussion and stimulate cross-cultural ideas and thinking and so on. And so you're not working to impose something, you're engaging in a dialogue with people.
Where in the world is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights referred to in courts as a document we must follow? Is it anywhere? Does anybody follow?
No, the Universal Declaration is not legally binding. The international covenants are in those countries that have ratified them. And those things, those things are, I work much more with the CRC than the international covenants, but the CRC, does get cited in courts. It does get cited in holding governments to account.
Countries like Jersey, where these conventions, treaties, whatever covenants haven't been activated, they haven't been given the right of petition or whatever it is, where are they affected? Does anybody, because I've had lawyers say to me, the Universal Declaration is like a common law for the world now. It's a standard, like you started saying, they become a standard, a norm. But if they're a norm, then you ought to go to court and say, look, this is the norm, I want these rights. But it doesn't work.
You'd use the international covenants, right?
Whatever, or the Universal Declaration. These are in 1948. That's been in place.
I know, but it's not. It's a declaration. It's not international law.
It's what we're trying to achieve. This is where, like customary law, this is how it becomes customary law, because you accept it as being. This is the way you do things. This is supposed to be how it works. My naive way of looking at it. That's
Well, these things are, there are huge things that are still wrong. As I said right at the beginning, that human rights are not. They're not magic bullets. They're not magic wands. They don't achieve what they are. In a way, they are standards. They are legally binding in the sense that we've signed up to them, legally binding standards, but they provide a kind of blueprint and a framework for how we want to, the kind of society we want to be and how we want to move forward. And inevitably, it's a conflictual relationship, because often rights are in conflict with each other. Often there are huge backlashes. At the moment we have enormous challenges in moving forward. If you look at just look at the problem of the digital environment and what's happening in the digital environment in terms of eroding and undermining democracy, if we look at the growth of authoritarianism, and I mean, just in the UK this week, you know, we're seeing the undermining of the rule of law. We've seen this government try to undermine
revocation of certain human rights itself. They're actually attacking human rights. That's potential.
They want to restrict the freedoms of the judiciary. They want to block judicial review. They want to limit the powers of Parliament. They want to pass legislation which explicitly breaks their agreements under an international treaty. You know, so these things are deeply worrying. And then you look at Trump and you look at Bolsonaro and Xi and Putin and the rest of them, and we have a growing number of highly authoritarian populist states where there is
the norm, isn't it? It is becoming the norm.
It is. So we're, you know, in many ways, you know, we're threatened with moving backwards. We've also got, you know, backlash by many religious and fundamentalist groups against children's rights. There's a kind of strong family lobby which argues that children should be recontained. I mean, that was one of the things that was great about the CRC specifically, as opposed to other treaties, is that it recognized children not as simply subsumed within the family, but as individual subjects of right on their own behalf, and that they had to be recognized and respected as such. And what the sort of fundamentalist movement is interested in doing really is pushing those advances back in the basket, as it were, and reframing under the language of parental rights.
In Turkey, the Istanbul Agreement, or whatever it was, about violence in the home and violence against women. I mean, it's called the Istanbul Treaty, isn't it? I think that's what it's called, the Istanbul Article. And lo and behold, the government in Turkey apparently is trying to crawl that back so that men can beat up their wives. Well, what a situation that is.
No, it's so I'm not, you know, I suppose the difference, I think, with what we're saying is I'm not suggesting that we are in a wonderful place. I think I feel more depressed and more frightened indeed about the future than I've ever felt in the whole of my life, because of the way that the sort of political movement seems to be going and the undermining of democracy. So I'm deeply depressed about where we're heading. But that doesn't mean that I would give up on the importance of international human rights standards and continuing to fight to try and see those rights implemented and upheld. And so the fact that something is going backwards rather than forwards doesn't invalidate those principles and the importance of those standards. You just have to fight even harder to try and make progress against so much of a sort of
countries like China, America, and Britain, the UK, influential countries, are going to backtrack on these. I mean, they're going to rubbish them. They're going to finish them. These conventions will die, won't they? The aspirations will die.
Yes, and you know, there's some interesting things happening, right? So we're faced with a climate emergency now. Now that we have the optional protocol on communications for the CRC, you know, which allows children to make complaints when the rights have been violated and they've exhausted all avenues of complaint within country and so on. So there's a really interesting case being taken to the committee on the basis that by Greta Thunberg and a number of other young people, they're being supported by a firm of lawyers in the UK, in London, arguing that their Article 6 rights, their rights to optimum development, and their rights to non-discrimination, I think, and I think there are 3 rights are being violated by and I think they're citing about 6 countries as being directly in breach of their rights under the CRC. Now, the committee can't do anything about climate change, and it can't force any of those governments to act, but it empowers young people to have a voice in the international arena, and it gives them another avenue for advocacy. So Greta Thunberg has used many different avenues for advocacy around environmental campaigning over recent years, and this is another way that she can advocate. Doesn't mean she'll win, what it means is that we need as many tools as possible in order to move forward.
It's remarkable you've got such a young person, and somebody like Attenborough who couldn't be much older, could he? I mean, there are people, where are the people in the middle? I just despair. Well, why is everybody else doing? Like, we've got a finance industry. I got to mention the finance industry. What are they doing about it all? I mean, they don't. It's just it's like the old slave trade still alive. They don't seem to worry about all this, do they? It doesn't seem to touch them. But it really affects them. It'll affect them.
It will affect everybody. It will affect everybody. I mean, people are worried about immigration now. I mean, as the ice caps melt and the seas rise, the amount of land which is available to live in will be reduced. The number of species available will be diminished. The problem of refugees will become infinitely greater. They will be, without land, without anything. It's in all of our interest. It's in all of our interest to take these issues seriously.
My conference going here because of the COVID problem. I mean, that suits the establishment, I think, delightedly, but that's a universal problem. That's everywhere in the world. That's another factor which is going to suppress human rights, because it's a great opportunity, isn't it, to suppress any aspirations to enforceable rights.
Yes, it is. So I've been working around the COVID issue on. I chair an organisation called Child to Child, which is it's a very small international NGO working on empowering children to act as agents within their own communities, and it was started pre-CRC in the 1970s by the Institute of Child Health and Institute of Education in London, two professors. And it's a self perpetuating, cheap and easy methodology for working with children and communities. But we've got some fabulous materials over the years and worked on amazing projects and programs and so on. So what we've done at a group of volunteers putting together those materials, adapting them, because a lot of people are gathering data on how children are coping with COVID. There's been a lot of work and research on, what's going on for children. But what we've been trying to do is say children can be agents within their own communication, within their own communities. They can be agents of addressing issues around child protection and health and education, and act as positive contributors within their own community, not just help.
Children are still treated here as a sort of a nuisance to a large extent. Their views are not taken seriously. Like the Greta's, the ridicule that Greta's had is dreadful. When you Greta, when you go to places like Kenya, do they have a community which is more embracing of children's views? Are they more open to that or not? Is it still the same adult resistance to children?
I think there's adult resistance to children everywhere, but I think things have changed. I do see a change in 30 years, that there is now a willingness to recognise that there is something to learn from children, that there is a place in listening to children and engaging their perspectives and their ideas. I'm currently working with a group of people with the Committee on the Rights of the Child I've done a number of general comments, working with the Committee on General Comments, with these, sort of elaborations of a particular article or a particular issue. So this one is looking at children's rights in the digital environment. And as a contribution to that, we've done that. One of the partners, she's an academic in Australia, has done a consultation globally with about 800 children around the world about how they're experiencing the digital environment, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child taking that very, very seriously. And that will be the findings from that consultation will significantly influence the text of the general comment. Now, many, many governments are really, really keen to get this general comment. Macron, for example, apparently is interested in accessing the general comment as soon as it comes out, because they're struggling with how to protect children and to promote access in the digital environment, and how to do it right. So there is interest, and what we're trying to do is frame that within the context of their obligations under the CRC, and how you both protect children's rights in that environment and how you use that environment in order to enhance children's rights. And I think that, those things wouldn't have happened 30 years ago. They just would not have happened. So now we will have a document informing and guiding and advising governments, which will be significantly influenced by the direct experiences of children all over the world. And I think that's progress. So it's not perfect, and we can't guarantee governments will take account of it. But the fact that it's happened is important.
I mean, I despair on lots of grounds, because the reaction between people who vote for somebody, I mean, the small number of people that do in this island especially, and the response they expect to get from the people they vote for, there is no real dialogue. There is no dialogue, is there? And it's a wish list, isn't it? And it's the same. You can tell it's the same with the governments everywhere. Trump doesn't listen to individuals. If somebody comes up and says you're doing a wonderful job, he loves that.
Yeah,
but if he's got anything critical to say, he says they're an idiot. Now, that's the scale of it. And basically, that seems to be what governments are becoming. They're not this dialogue, the old idea that you elect a representative. That's one of my hobby horses at the moment. It's dying, but this is the conventions, European conventions, international conventions. They seem to support the other view, that we don't want the interference. We don't want the European interference. It's that sort of view. It's another reason not to have a dialogue, isn't it? It's another reason to do it ourselves. When history shows it's always been defective. Leave it to governments and they will make a mess of it, won't they? I'm a bit about this process by which you can have whatever international conventions we like. But if the governments aren't responsible, they're not even responding to very simple domestic things, why should they bother? Why will they bother?
My point is that there have been changes, and there have been laws, and those laws in many countries are being complied with, and the age of criminal responsibility has been raised. So it's not, you can't say this has achieved nothing and no one's taking the account. Clearly they have. It's not good enough, and there's a huge mountain still to climb. But we have made, in some areas, we have made progress. More children are in school.
Indeed. And I'm a child of that progress, and I believed it. I was stupid enough to believe it, but the governments around the world are revoking these things. This is what they're doing. Governments are actually stepping back.
It's true. We're seeing a massive growth in anti-democratic authoritarian governments. That's absolutely right. That is the case, and that, you know, that is a cause for deep and serious and profound concern. But so what do we do? Do we just say, well, throw up our hands and say, well, we can't do anything about it? Or do you keep doing what you can, little though it is, you know, to try and protect and promote and move this agenda forward? I mean, I was at a conference last year, was working with UNICEF on, on the Child Friendly Cities program, and we it was the first ever global summit of child friendly cities, and they were representative mayors and politicians and NGOs and UNICEF from all over the world. Plus, we had 80 children and young people there that we've been working with in preparing the agenda. And it was extraordinary. I mean, the presentations, many of the things that mayors are doing at the community level in their municipalities are striking and innovatory and important and transformatory. Some are not doing anything, but those things are happening and have happened, and they wouldn't have happened without the CRC.
So tell me briefly, we got to wind up at some point.
Yeah.
I could talk for hours, or you could talk for hours, I'm for sure, because you've got lots of interesting information in your head, and I want it. But where do you go next week? What are you doing next week? Who are you talking to? The week after that, who are you talking to? How wide is? I mean, bearing in mind it's lockdown and all the rest of it. Are you still speaking to people around the world? Is that what your agenda now is?
Yes. So for example, I'm working at the moment with UNICEF on the EU developing their child rights strategy for the next 5 years, and for the first time ever, they've agreed this time to undertake a consultation with children. We've just been working on the questionnaire. It's going to go out this week to children all over Europe. There are going to be focus groups run by SAVE, Eurochild, UNICEF, and others across Europe to get children's input, which will inform the child rights strategy. I'm working with the Council of Europe. We've just done a series of 9. We've developed a set of tools for how to set 10 indicators on how to measure the implementation by governments of Article 12. We've now worked with 9 governments. We've worked with 3 a year over the last 6 years, and so they work for a year, undertaking an analysis against these indicators, and then they develop an action plan for implementation and moving forward. So yesterday we had a sort of online conference to reflect and review on where we'd got to and what the lessons were out of that. The Council of Europe are hoping to get a significant grant from the EU to upscale and extend that work. So we're hoping to take that forward and look at how we can embed and strengthen the work and bring it out to more countries across Europe. So, these things are happening.
Does your relationship with the European Union continue whatever Boris does to it? Does that?
Yeah, because it's not contingent on me working from the UK. Otherwise, I'd be stymied. So we can't be part of it because, English children are not being, British children are not being.
That's that time. I'm going to have to stop. But I would just like to say, personally, whenever you're dealing with these organisations, could you put a little piece of paper in the box to say to consider the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man? Don't forget, because nobody puts them on their agenda. We're not part of it, and we get missed out.
Yeah, I can see it, and I felt when I came that it was a long, long time ago. But I mean, you described it, and I experienced it. That there's a sense of complacency that everything is basically all right, and there's no need for change. But yeah. And
still, until the tide stops coming in and out, everything's okay. If that stops one day, they will realise something's gone wrong here. Anything else, tell me? Anything else to say? Anything else before we close down?
No. I think I said enough.
Thanks a lot. I'll see if I can turn the machine off now, but thank you so much for speaking.
Okay.